Welcome back to the channel, friends. If you love powerful stories from America's past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss one now. On a day of joy and celebration, a wealthy family gathered for a grand wedding feast. But hidden in the kitchen, a silent cook had a plan of her own. With steady hands, she turned a table of laughter into a table of death. This is the chilling tale of sweet revenge, bitter death, the cook who ended the celebration. The house stood tall, its wooden beams polished, its windows trimmed with garlands of fresh flowers. It was a day of pride, of triumph. The family inside bustled with preparations for the great wedding, eager to show their wealth, their importance, their place in the world. The bride glowed in her lace dress, her cheeks flushed with nervous excitement. Her father greeted the arriving guests with stiff confidence, the master of a household that seemed untouchable. Music floated faintly through the hallways, and laughter rose and fell as neighbors, relatives, and partners arrived to celebrate. But behind the doors of the kitchen, another world existed. Hot, crowded, and filled with the constant crackle of fire. It was a place where labor never ceased. Pots clattered, ovens roared, and the air was heavy with the smell of roasted meats, buttered vegetables, and sugared pastries. There, away from the grand speeches and the proud smiles, worked the cook, a woman whose hands had shaped countless meals, whose back had bent for years under chains both seen and unseen. She was not a guest at the feast, nor a member of the family, though without her there would be no celebration at all. She was enslaved, her body owned, her time stolen. Her skill in the kitchen had always been praised but never honored. She lived in shadows, feeding others while often going hungry herself, serving without thanks, enduring without rest. And on this day, the day of her master's greatest joy, she chose to act. Her decision had not been made lightly. It had grown in her chest for years, born of cruelty, of humiliation, of grief too deep to name. Some whispered that she had lost a child to violence or sale. Others believed she had borne endless insults, blows, and hunger until her heart had hardened. Whatever the cause, she carried a small pouch hidden in her apron. It held powder she had gathered slowly, secretly, taken from herbs and mixtures not meant for food but for ending life. Her hands moved with practiced ease, sprinkling here, stirring there, into the stews, into the sauces, into the glazes that coated golden pies. Not enough to notice at first taste, not enough to betray itself with bitterness. Just enough that each bite carried more than flavor. It carried an ending. Above, the guests gathered. The long wooden tables shone with dishes prepared by her hand. Roasted birds gleamed with crisp skins. Fresh bread, still warm, was torn apart and passed down the line. Bowls of thick stew steamed, fragrant with herbs. Sugared cakes and pastries glistened in the candlelight. The family smiled proudly as their guests praised the feast, never sparing a thought for the woman who had made it possible. The bride laughed as she leaned close to her new husband. The father of the bride beamed, swelling with pride. Mothers and children ate heartily. Neighbors congratulated one another. The fiddler played, and the hall pulsed with joy. The cook moved silently among them, carrying platters, refilling bowls, bowing her head. To them, she was invisible. But to herself, she was sharper than she had ever been. Her eyes fixed on what she had set in motion. It began quietly. A guest shifted uneasily in his chair, his hand pressed against his stomach. Another's laughter faltered, her face paling as she set down her fork. The father of the bride cleared his throat, then coughed, his voice breaking into sudden silence. The bride blinked, swaying where she sat, her hand trembling as it touched the edge of the table. First, the guests brushed it off. Too much food, perhaps. Too much excitement. But the unease spread. A chair scraped loudly as a man rose, then collapsed back into it with a groan. Silver utensils clattered as women dropped them in surprise. The fiddler stopped playing, his bow quivering in his hand. The cook watched. She stood still, her face unreadable, her hands folded before her. Years of being unseen had taught her the power of silence. Now, she let silence reign. The hall grew chaotic. Some stumbled toward the doors, but their legs betrayed them. Others bent forward, gasping, clutching at anything near. The bride's veil slipped as she cried out, her new husband falling heavily against her. Children whimpered, mothers screamed, men shouted, but no one could stop what was already moving through their bodies. The proud father fell to his knees, his once commanding voice broken into hoarse pleas. He begged for help, for mercy, but there was none to give. One by one, they succumbed. The kitchen, once her prison, had become her weapon. The feast, meant for joy, became their undoing. By nightfall, the house that had rung with laughter was silent. The music, the speeches, the clinking of silver, all gone. In their place lay stillness, heavy and final, and in that silence stood the cook, the woman they had owned, the woman they had dismissed. She was alone now, surrounded by the bodies of those who had ruled over her. In her chest, perhaps, there was no triumph, no smile of victory, only something heavier, darker, a release born of endless years of pain. Sweet revenge, perhaps, but also bitter death. Morning crept over the house with a stillness so heavy it felt unnatural. The sunlight, usually soft and forgiving, spilled into rooms that had been filled with laughter only the day before. But now, it touched overturned chairs, stained tablecloths, and faces pale with death. The air was stale, carrying not the scent of roasted meats or sweet cakes, but the sharp tang of sickness and finality. Neighbors were the first to arrive, drawn by whispers of silence where music should have been, by curiosity that turned swiftly to dread. They stepped hesitantly through the doors, expecting to find a family still celebrating, perhaps still dancing. Instead, they froze, hands covering their mouths, as the sight unfolded before them. Men sprawled over chairs, women slumped beside plates, children curled beneath the tables. The bride lay still, her veil torn, her husband collapsed across her. The proud father, the master of the house, lay at the center, his arms stretched as though he had fought to rise one final time. The kitchen door stood ajar, but no smoke rose from its hearth. The pots were cold, the pans left where they had been dropped, and in the silence of that kitchen, there was no sign of the cook. Whispers spread faster than fire in a dry field. The neighbors murmured of curses, of punishment from heaven, of sins brought to bear. Others, more suspicious, spoke of hands inside the house, hands that cooked, hands that served, hands that might have held the power to strike silently. It did not take long before eyes turned toward the enslaved. The cook, in particular, became the shadow in every tale told that day. She had been there, moving quietly, unseen but present. Some swore they had glimpsed her face, calm as death spread across the table. Others claimed she had vanished before the worst began, slipping into the night. None knew for certain, but certainty was not needed. In their minds, guilt had already been decided. The local men gathered, grim and resolute. They spoke of justice, of order, of the need to make an example. Fear hung thick in the room as they searched, knowing that if the cook had done what they believed, then the power she had wielded was greater than any weapon they carried. She had taken lives not with blades or fire, but with the very food meant to sustain. Children, wide-eyed, clung to their mothers, who murmured prayers under their breath. Neighbors, once eager to share in the family's wealth and feasting, now recoiled from the sight of it. The same table that had displayed bounty now bore ruin, and the same hall that had welcomed joy now echoed with grief. When the cook was finally found, she did not run. She stood tall, though her wrists were quickly bound. Her face bore no smile, no tears. Some said she looked weary, as though she had carried this burden too long. Others said her eyes held fire, a quiet defiance that unsettled even the strongest of men. They dragged her back to the house, forcing her to stand among the bodies. "Look at what you've done," they demanded, their voices shaking with anger, with fear, with something deeper they dared not name. She did not look away. She did not beg. In the stillness of her silence, there was a kind of strength they could not understand. The family's relatives wailed, their cries rising like broken hymns. The men, stiff and stern, debated what punishment should come. Some called for swift death, others for torment, others for fire. But all agreed that she could not be allowed to live free after such a deed. The news spread beyond the town. Riders carried the story to nearby farms and settlements. A wedding feast poisoned, an entire household destroyed, and an enslaved cook at the center of it all. At every stop, the tale grew darker. Some said she had cursed the food with words of witchcraft. Others claimed she had smiled as the family fell, as if savoring each breath they lost. Still others whispered of her sorrow, that she had lost children to the auction block and acted not from joy but from pain too deep to bear. Around fires and in churches, people debated. Was she a monster, or was she a woman pushed past the limits of endurance? Some, though fewer, spoke softly of understanding. They knew what it meant to suffer, to bend under cruelty until something inside snapped. But such voices were hushed, for fear of punishment themselves. The household that had once stood as a symbol of pride now stood as a warning. Its doors hung open, its windows dark. Few dared enter. The smell of sickness lingered for days, refusing to leave, as if the walls themselves remembered. And in the center of it all stood the cook, bound but unbroken, silent but louder than any cry. She had taken the one moment meant to display her master's power and turned it into their downfall. In doing so, she had carved her name into whispers that would outlive her, whether as villain or as something more. The men prepared to decide her fate. The weight of that decision hung heavy, not only for her, but for all those still living in chains. For if one woman could strike so deeply at the heart of power, then what did that mean for the rest who bent under its weight? The town braced itself, torn between fear and fascination. They knew punishment was coming. But punishment alone could not erase the memory of what she had done. The wedding feast had ended in silence, but the story of the cook was only just beginning. The cook stood in the center of the yard, her wrists bound with coarse rope. Around her, the townspeople gathered in a ring, their faces grim, their voices low. Some had come out of anger, others out of fear, and some simply to see what would happen to a woman who had done what few dared even imagine. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed. Old men leaned on canes, shaking their heads as though to say the world had turned upside down. The men of the town, judges, preachers, farmers, and planters, stood at the front, their shoulders stiff, their expressions hardened. They spoke of law and order, of the need to strike fear into anyone who might think to follow her path. Their words rose into the air, sharp and heavy, but she did not flinch. Some swore she looked straight ahead, her eyes fixed on something far beyond them, something they could not see. Others whispered that her silence was worse than curses, that her calmness mocked them, that she had already taken from them the one thing they could never get back, their sense of safety, for that was what haunted them most. Not just the death of a family, not even the grief of seeing a bride taken on her wedding day. What burned deepest was the knowledge that it had been done not by an invading army, nor by a fire or flood, but by one they had believed beneath them, by food they themselves had demanded, prepared in the kitchen they never entered, by hands they had owned, hands they had ordered, hands they thought powerless, and now, those same hands had brought them face to face with mortality. The punishment, they declared, would be severe. It had to be. She could not be allowed to stand as a symbol of defiance, a reminder of how fragile their power truly was. They spoke of justice, but it was fear that guided their voices. Fear that her silence would spread louder than their decrees, that others would see what she had done and begin to imagine that as they dragged her to the place of execution, the people followed. Some jeered, others spat curses, while a few turned their faces away, unable to bear the sight. But no one dared speak for her. To do so would be to invite suspicion, to risk being branded as sympathizers. She was made to stand before them, her figure framed by the gallows they had built in haste. The rope hung like a shadow above her. The preacher muttered prayers, calling on God to cleanse the land of sin. The judge spoke of law, of order, of the balance that must be restored. Yet all their words rang hollow against the sight of her. Stillness. When they asked if she had anything to say, she did not beg. She did not plead for forgiveness. She did not confess, nor deny. She only lifted her chin, her eyes meeting the crowd. For a moment, silence spread. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if waiting. Some said later that her gaze was fierce, burning with defiance. Others claimed it was heavy with sorrow, that it carried the weight of every wrong she had endured. Still others insisted they saw nothing at all, only emptiness, an emptiness so deep it chilled them to their bones. And then it was over. The rope tightened. The crowd shifted, murmuring, but there was no cheer, no victory, only a heaviness that hung in the air long after her body had stilled. Mothers held their children tighter. Men adjusted their hats, avoiding each other's eyes. The judge's words faded quickly, the preacher's prayers forgotten. The people dispersed, but the unease remained. The house where the family had died was left to rot, its doors closed, its windows dark. Travelers who passed by spoke of the silence that clung to it, of the way animals avoided its yard. Children dared each other to step onto its porch, but none lingered long. The story of the cooks spread far beyond the town. In some places, it was told as a warning, proof that the enslaved could never be trusted, that they must be watched and broken lest they rise. In others, it became a whisper of hope, passed quietly among those who still bent their backs under chains, a reminder that even the smallest, most unseen hand could strike at power. And so she lived on, not in her body, but in memory. To some, a monster. To others, a martyr. To many, a ghost that lingered in kitchens, in dining halls, in the very act of breaking bread. The men who had ordered her death went about their lives, but the memory of her eyes haunted them. They could not sit at a table without remembering. The feast turned funeral. They could not command a servant without wondering if obedience hid something sharper. And though they built gallows, though they spoke of control, they never fully escaped the shadow she had cast. For once the seed of fear is planted, it does not die easily, and her silence had planted it deep. As time moved on, as it always does. Seasons changed, harvests came and went, children were born, and elders passed. But in that town, the memory of the wedding feast lingered like a shadow no sunlight could erase. The house where it had happened stood abandoned. Its shutters rattled in the wind, its roof sagged, its windows clouded with dust. No family ever claimed it again. Travelers who rode past lowered their voices, some crossing themselves, others whispering prayers. Children dared each other to step onto the porch, but even the bravest never stayed long. They said the air was too heavy, that it smelled of sickness, that whispers seemed to float from the darkened windows. A few swore they saw a figure in the kitchen doorway, a woman in plain clothes, watching silently. Grown men laughed off such tales in daylight, but at night, even they avoided the path that ran past the house. The cook herself was gone, her body returned to the earth. But her story lived on, told and retold in hushed voices. Among the powerful, it was spoken as a warning, proof that those in chains must never be trusted fully, that control had to be tighter, harsher, more unyielding. Fear sharpened their cruelty, and every glance at a servant's steady hands carried suspicion. Among the enslaved, the story traveled differently. It was never told loudly, never shared in the presence of masters, but in the quiet of night, in cabins where the air carried both sorrow and hope. Whispers spread of the woman who had refused to remain invisible. Some spoke of her as a spirit of vengeance, others as a mother whose grief had driven her past the edge of fear. Many called her simply brave, for she had struck at those who believed themselves untouchable. Her silence, her calmness, her refusal to beg, all became part of the tale. Children grew up hearing of her, not as a monster, but as proof that strength lived even in those forced to kneel. To them, her story was not just of death, but of defiance. Yet the story never sat easily. It carried both admiration and dread, both sorrow and unease. For while her act had brought down a family, it had also brought suffering to others who lived under the same chains. Punishments grew harsher, suspicions deeper. Every meal served after that day carried with it the weight of mistrust. The masters ate, but never fully in peace. The enslaved cooked, but always under sharper eyes, and still, the memory of her act refused to fade. Years later, when the country shifted and the chains of slavery began to break, her story remained half legend, half truth. Some told it as a warning about anger left to grow. Others told it as a hymn of strength, a reminder that even the most silent could rise. In old kitchens, in abandoned houses, in the quiet corners of history, her shadow lingered. The old wedding house finally fell to ruin, its beams collapsing, its walls swallowed by vines. The dining table rotted where it stood, plates buried under dust and time. Nature reclaimed what pride and wealth had once built. But the story of what had happened there, the feast, the silence, the reckoning, could not be buried, and so it lives on, carried in whispers, in warnings, in secret songs. A tale of a woman unseen, who became unforgettable. A tale of a wedding day that ended in death. A tale of sweet revenge and bitter truth. For in the end, it was not just a family that perished. It was the illusion of safety, the belief in untouchable power, the arrogance of those who feasted while others starved. And in their place stood the memory of the cook, silent, steady, and unbroken, even in death. Her story remains not in books or records, but in the echoes of fear and the whispers of defiance. A reminder carved into history's shadow that the overlooked can change everything in a single, terrible moment. And that is the lasting memory of sweet revenge, bitter death. The cook who ended the celebration.